picking up our expectation series on the story of Joseph today. We all have dreams and expectations in life. They might be very everyday dreams. They might be more life-shaping dreams about career or marriage or family or church or the gifts that God's given you, maybe even faith itself. They're often quite unspoken in our lives, aren't they? But they're still really quite powerful. This isn't the job I wanted. This isn't the marriage I dreamed of. I never expected my kids to get that diagnosis. I never thought following Jesus would be like this, and so on. And it causes disappointment and frustration and anger and sadness to kind of grow as the gap between our expectations and our reality becomes more visible. I'm sure this sounds familiar. We've seen that Joseph was a guy with dreams too, God-given dreams, in fact. But more than that, he was a guy with certain expectations of what those dreams would look like in his life. And unfortunately, over this series, we've also seen that all of those expectations get shattered time and time again as the journey to the purposes of God in Joseph's life was harder and different and longer than he expected. So it's now been many years. Looks like all those dreams have died. But today we see that those God-given dreams to Joseph still hold fast. Yes, they look different. Yes, it was hard work to get there. Yes, it took a lot longer. But today we're going to see that the dreams also ended up being much better than Joseph expected too. So we're going to cover 7 chapters today. Obviously, I can't read all of them. So I'm going to read a passage from the start in Genesis 41 and a passage from the key section in Genesis 45, and then I'm going to summarize the other bits in between. Just for a bit of context, you might remember that Pharaoh has just called Joseph up out of the prison, up out of the pit, to interpret his dream after the cupbearer finally remembered about him. Joseph's interpreted the dream about 7 years of plenty and 7 years of famine, and he's given Pharaoh a plan. And then we're going to read from Genesis 41, verse 37. So the plan seemed good to Pharaoh and to all his officials. So Pharaoh asked them, "Can we find anyone like this man, one in whom is the Spirit of God?" And then Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Since God's made all this known to you, there's no one so discerning and wise as you. You shall be in charge of my palace, and all my people are to submit to your orders. Only with respect to the throne will I be greater than you." So Pharaoh said to Joseph, "I hereby put you in charge of the whole land of Egypt." And then Pharaoh took his signet ring from his finger and put it on Joseph's finger. He dressed him in robes of fine linen and put a gold chain round his neck. He made him ride in a chariot as his second in command, and people shouted before him, "Make way!" Thus he put him in charge of the whole land of Egypt. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, "I'm Pharaoh, but without your word, no one will lift hand or foot in all of Egypt." And Pharaoh gave Joseph the name Zaphenath-Paneah and gave him Asenath, daughter of Potiphera, priest of On, to be his wife. And Joseph rose up over the land of Egypt. Joseph was 30 years old when he entered the service of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And Joseph went out from Pharaoh's presence and traveled throughout Egypt. During the 7 years of abundance, the land produced plentifully. Joseph collected all the food produced in those 7 years of abundance in Egypt and stored it in the cities. In each city, he put the food that was grown in the fields surrounding it. Joseph stored up huge quantities of grain like the sand of the sea. It was so much that he stopped keeping records because it was beyond measure. But before the years of famine came, 2 sons were born to Joseph by Asenath, daughter of Potiphera, priest of On. Joseph named his firstborn Manasseh and said, "It's because God has made me forget all my trouble and all my father's household." And the second son he named Ephraim and said, "It's because God has made me fruitful in the land of my suffering." And the 7 years of abundance in Egypt came to an end, and the 7 years of famine began, just as Joseph had said. There was famine in all the other lands, but in the whole land of Egypt there was food. When all Egypt began to feel the famine, the people cried to Pharaoh for food. And then Pharaoh told all the Egyptians, "Go to Joseph, do what he tells you." When the famine had spread over the whole country, Joseph opened all the storehouses and sold grain to the Egyptians, for the famine was severe throughout Egypt. And all the world came to Egypt to buy grain from Joseph, because the famine was severe everywhere. Now, before we read Genesis 45, what happens in the intervening chapters is that Jacob, Joseph's dad, sends his sons, his 10 oldest sons, down to Egypt to buy food as the famines hit them in Canaan too. And Joseph recognizes his brothers, but they don't recognize him. And Joseph accuses them of being spies and tests them by demanding that they return with Benjamin, his youngest brother and his only full brother. He keeps Simeon behind as a bit of a hostage and secretly places the silver that they used to buy the food back into their bags. The brothers start to think God's punishing them for how they treated Joseph. And when the food runs out again, Judah, one of Joseph's older brothers, persuades their dad to let Benjamin go with them so that they can buy some more food. So they get back to Egypt. Joseph welcomes them, lets Simeon out of prison, hosts them a meal, and sets up another test for them by showing favoritism to Benjamin in a similar way to how he was favored by his father. But as they leave, he again secretly places the silver back in their bags, and a particular silver cup in Benjamin's bag. And after they leave, they're stopped and searched, and Benjamin looks guilty. The brothers are hugely distressed. Joseph says he'll keep Benjamin as a slave. But Judah steps forward and offers himself as a substitute for Benjamin, showing that the brothers are no longer the men who sold Joseph into slavery. And then we're going to pick up in Genesis 45, the first 15 verses. Then Joseph could no longer control himself before all his attendants, and he cried out, "Make everyone leave my presence." So there was no one with Joseph when he made himself known to his brothers. And he wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard him, and Pharaoh's household heard about it. And Joseph said to his brothers, "I am Joseph. Is my father still alive?" But his brothers were not able to answer him because they were terrified at his presence. Then Joseph said to his brothers, "Come close to me," which is probably the last thing they wanted to hear. But when they'd done so, he said, "I'm your brother Joseph, the one you sold into Egypt. Now, don't be distressed. Don't be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. For 2 years now, there's been famine in the land, and for the next 5 years, there'll be no plowing and reaping. But God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on earth and to save your lives by a great deliverance. So then it was not you who sent me here, but God. He made me father to Pharaoh, lord of his entire household, ruler of all Egypt. Now hurry back to my father and say to him, 'This is what your son Joseph says. God's made me lord of all Egypt. Come down to me, don't delay. You shall live in the region of Goshen and be near me. You, your children, your grandchildren, your flocks and herds, and all you have. I will provide for you there, because 5 years of famine are still to come. Otherwise, you and your household and all who belong to you will become destitute. You can see for yourselves, and so can my brother Benjamin, that it's really I who am speaking to you. Tell my father about all the honor accorded me in Egypt, and bring everything you've seen, and bring my father down here quickly.' Then he threw his arms around his brother Benjamin and wept. And Benjamin embraced him, weeping. And he kissed all his brothers and wept over them. Afterwards, his brothers talked with him." This is the word of the Lord. So, after this, 2 more chapters after this, Pharaoh invites Joseph's family to settle in the best part of the land of Egypt, Goshen. Joseph sends his brothers home with food and with garments and tells them to bring everyone back. Now, understandably, his dad's a little bit shocked at first, but soon believes, particularly when God speaks to him and tells him not to be afraid to go to Egypt. There's an emotional reunion with his dad where he weeps on him. And then he presents them all to Pharaoh. And you get this great little bit of the story where Jacob, his dad, blesses Pharaoh. And Joseph settles them in Goshen and provides all the food they need, while also ensuring the rest of Egypt has all that they need to live as well. Now, as I've been rereading the story of Joseph over the past couple of months, It really is an incredible story. But I just want to start this morning by telling you another story. A story of a Christian man who died just earlier this year at the age of 95. John Perkins was African American, born in rural Mississippi in 1930 during the Great Depression, some of the worst moments of Jim Crow segregation. His mother died of malnutrition because of their poverty when he was only 7 months old. His father walked out on him around the same time. He and his eldest brother went to live with their grandmother. And at the age of 16, John held his eldest brother in his arms as he died after he was clubbed and shot to death by a racist town marshal. His family decided that John would be safer in California, so he fled west with lunch, one change of clothes, and $3 to his name. Now, after all of this, it's probably fair to say that John dreamed of just living a normal life in California, earning an equivalent wage to the white man, getting married, having children. He himself said in this time that his only aim was making money, living a comfortable, prosperous life with his wife and his children. But at the age of 26, 27, John met Jesus and gave his life to him. He started preaching, evangelizing, ministering to black teenagers who'd come from the South and were in trouble with the law. Just a few years later, he felt Jesus telling him to return to Mississippi. Why on earth would he go? It's where his mother had died in poverty because there wasn't a fair wage. It's where his brother was murdered. He was bitter. His wife didn't want to go. He said that he'd learnt to hate all the white people in Mississippi. But eventually, they did decide to move back home, and over the next 10 years, John and his wife, Vera May, built a big ministry in Mississippi. Bible classes, evangelism, a church, a thrift store, community projects, health center, civil rights activism, so on. John Perkins knew that people needed to encounter Jesus through the gospel, but also through health and education and jobs and practical help. And in 1970, after trying to help some student protesters, John was arrested and he was beaten brutally in jail, nearly to the point of death, by racist white police officers. The attack, the stress of his mistreatment, led to a heart attack. Right, this was not the dream. This was not the comfortable, safe, prosperous life that he'd been working towards in California. It was dangerous, it cost him deeply. And it brought him face to face with the hatred that he thought he'd left behind, that he thought he'd forgotten about. But it was better. Not better by the world's definition, not even better by John's definition, perhaps. Not better because it made life easier or insulated him from pain, but better by God's definition. It was a full year after his beating in prison that before John spoke again publicly. His son, Spencer, wrote about going to hear John speak to an all-black audience in California, eager to hear what John was going to say. He'd seen his father the morning after the beating, so he was fairly traumatized. He hoped John would say, in his words, he hoped John would say that Christianity was only for white people and that he wanted nothing more to do with it. Instead, John said, "Before my Brandon jail experience, I thought blacks were the only victims of racism. But when I saw the faces of those men in the jail, twisted by the hate of racism, I know that they were victims too. I just couldn't hate back." And his son wrote of this moment, "I can't possibly explain to you how much I hated to hear him say those words. After all we'd suffered at the hands of white people, and now we're supposed to forgive them. But I suppose it's what I knew I would hear, and deep down inside, I knew it was the truth." John Perkins came to believe that the gospel was strong enough to overthrow injustice and to overcome hatred and create reconciliation. He chose forgiveness over revenge. He chose healing over bitterness, neighbors over enemies, love over hate. John didn't simply escape poverty and injustice himself. He entered back into it so that God could use him to serve people who were trapped. continuing the work he'd already begun, actually from this point, his influence extending much, much wider than Mississippi. God gave John Perkins a life that was harder than the one he planned in California. It was different, but it was fuller, it was more fruitful, it was Christ-like, a life through which many people were served and given hope and invited into reconciliation with God and with one another. In the very place that John had been wounded, God made him an instrument of hope and of justice and of forgiveness and of reconciliation. The place of affliction became the place of blessing. And that's the kind of better that God so often gives, right? Not pain-free, not easier, not necessarily the life we would have planned, but a life in which we become more like Jesus, and a story in which our pain is caught up in order to bless others. And that's where the story of Joseph meets us. As I said, Joseph had dreams for his life, expectations of comfort and elevation, dreams that were all about him, and all that seemed gone. And then we get this moment where it looks like it's finally come to pass. Right, Joseph is elevated. He's placed in charge of Pharaoh's palace, or literally his house. It's the third house he's been placed in, Potiphar's house, the jail house, and now Pharaoh's house. An estate agent's dream, all this moving around. But actually in verse 41, Pharaoh put him in charge of more than just his house. He puts him in charge of the whole land of Egypt. He's given a ring, and he's given a fine robe, which is a reversal of Joseph's story, because it's not the first time he's been given a nice robe, is it? His dad gave him one in chapter 37. And since that point, he's had his robes stripped from him twice. Once by his brothers, as they sold him into slavery and threw him into the pit. And once by Potiphar's wife, who, as she was trying to sleep with him and he ran away, she grabbed hold of his robe and kept it. Right, that sign of favor from his dad has now been restored to him. And all Pharaoh's people are going to submit to him. Right, in verse 43, where the NIV reads, it says, make way. We can read that and think it kind of sounds a bit like, get out of the way or we're going to run you down. But that's not what that means. It is closer to something like pay homage, kneel, bow down. Right, not just his brothers bowing down, but all of Egypt bowing down to him. Joseph's 30 now. He was 17 when he was sold into slavery, so it's been 13 years. And then the 7 years of abundance makes it 20 years. Right? He's still a slave. He's in the service of Pharaoh, but he's living a pretty good life as a slave, as far as they go. He's living in luxury, riding round on his chariot limo. He's got married. He's got 2 sons. Manasseh, which means something like one who causes to forget, because he says God's made him forget all of the suffering in his father's house, the mistreatment of his brothers. Right? He's closed the door on the past 20 years. It no longer has a hold on him. In the birth of his son, he's freed from all that bondage. And his second son, Ephraim, which means twice fruitful, named because God has made Joseph fruitful in the land of his suffering, in Egypt. The place of Joseph's affliction, slavery, false accusations, injustice, prison, has become the place of blessing. Right? The 2 names together show that Joseph placed his trust in a God who preserves and a God who blesses. The famine comes, Joseph's plan's in motion, he's comfortable, he's with his family, he's with his chariot, with an overabundance of food. What more could he want? Right, most stories would end right here with Joseph's success. The better's been achieved. I'll finish the preach there. But God's definition of better is different. It's actually not really about Joseph at all. Right, when he first had all those dreams, all Joseph had in mind was his elevation. Right? His place over his brothers, even over his mother and father, that they would bow down to him, right? The favored son, the honored son, the son deserving of the finest of gifts in the eyes of his father. That amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat, as Andrew Lloyd Webber calls it. He would be in authority. He would be served. He would be paid homage and given worship. But the dream wasn't about that at all. God's definition of better was about the healing and the salvation of his family and the preservation of people from many different nations. And so 2 years into the famine, making Joseph nearly 40 now, God brings the famine to Canaan, where his family live, and his brothers have to go down to Egypt to buy food. God's better doesn't just let Joseph forget his past. It brings it into the present so that he can bring healing. Right, the brothers show up. Joseph was the governor of the land, the person who sold grain to all its people. So when Joseph's brothers arrived, they bowed down to him with their faces to the ground. Right, it looks like now the dreams are finally here. They finally bow before Joseph. And those two titles, actually, that Joseph's given, the governor or ruler and the one who sells grain, they're two titles. It's not just descriptions. They both relate to the dreams. So the first dream, if you remember, is the sun, the moon, and the stars bowing down to Joseph. Right, Joseph in that dream is in a position of authority as the ruler, as the governor. And the second dream, again, if you remember, was about the sheaves of wheat bowing down to him. In that dream, Joseph is in a position of provider, right, as the one who sells grain. So it's a complete fulfillment of those dreams that Joseph has seen. And then we get this verse. Although Joseph recognized his brothers, they did not recognize him. They assume he's dead, remember? He's probably clean-shaven in Egypt rather than having a big beard. It tells us that he speaks to them in Egyptian through an interpreter. He has an Egyptian name. He's wearing the dress of an Egyptian ruler, and it's been 20 years. He probably looks a little haggard. And then verse 9, then Joseph remembered his dreams about them, and he said to them, "You're spies." Right, the floodgates open. After forgetting Manasseh, the name of his son, he now remembers. And it opens up all of those bitter memories. And it seems slightly like he begins to lose control. He starts lashing out at them, calling them spies, telling them that he's going to lock all of them up unless they bring his brother Benjamin back to him. And then he throws them all in prison for 3 days. God often brings us back to the places and the people that form some of our deepest wounds. Right? He did it for Joseph. He did it for John Perkins. It can feel incredibly painful and difficult, but those unhealed wounds in our lives can cause an infection of bitterness in us. Right? And sometimes they need to be opened back up a little bit, not to cause a deeper wound, but to give an opportunity to heal, to clean all that pus and infection out of those wounds, to give it the time and the air that it needs to heal properly. And actually, in this story, each time Joseph weeps, which he does a lot over the 7 chapters, it's like a little bit more of that infection is cleared out. A little bit more of that healing comes. And while the brothers are in prison, Joseph seems to calm down a little bit and has a change of mind. He makes a different plan, just like they did to him back in chapter 37. He decides to test them. And this isn't a petty, revengeful toying with them. The word for tested there is used in the Bible to test metals, right? To determine the value of something. He's trying to figure out if they've changed or not over the last 20 years. So he takes one brother, Simeon, who knows why he picked him, maybe it was the one he least liked, and tells them all that he'll release Simeon if they return with Benjamin. And then, as I said, he secretly fills their bags back up with the silver that they used to buy the food. Will they do the same as they did for Joseph, leaving the brother in exchange for silver? Or will they make a different decision now? Right, God's brought the past back to Joseph, but he also does it to the brothers. They immediately connect all of this to that secret, long-buried sin and believe God's punishing them for it. Right? They're thinking, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, brother for a brother. It's not just the places and the people that have caused our deepest wounds that God brings back to us. It's the things that we've done, the mess that we've made, our sin. Those things that we've kept secret and buried deep and hidden in the dark. But the darkness is as light to him. And he exposes them in our lives not to bring shame, but to bring freedom. God's definition of better is different. is also about blessing others. Now, we saw in that passage that I read from Genesis 41, that there's a repeated word. It doesn't translate like that in the NIV, but it is the same Hebrew word, which I'll show you through now. So Genesis 41, verse 53. So the 7 years of abundance in Egypt came to an end, and the 7 years of famine began, just as Joseph had said. There was famine in all the other lands, but in the whole land of Egypt there was food. When all Egypt began to feel the famine, the people cried to Pharaoh for food. And Pharaoh told all the Egyptians, "Go to Joseph, do what he tells you." When the famine had spread over the whole country, Joseph opened all the storehouses, sold grain to the Egyptians, for the famine was severe. And all the world came to Egypt to buy grain from Joseph, because the famine was severe everywhere, which is literally in all the earth. That word, all, repeated time and time again in these 4 verses. Right, and it's doing 3 things. So firstly, it's simply telling us about the extent and the seriousness of the famine. Right? Secondly, it's supposed to remind us of Noah with that phrase, all the earth. Joseph is a type of Noah. Noah builds an ark, Joseph builds storehouses. Right? Noah saves only one family, but Joseph saves many families. But then the third thing, and the thing I really want to pick up on, is it's supposed to remind us of Abraham, and particularly God's promise to Abraham that through his seed all the peoples of the earth would be blessed. Joseph is a partial fulfillment of God's promise to Abraham, right? It was better because it was about blessing all the earth, because of God's promise, because he'd said to Noah that he would never destroy all the earth again, and so he blesses it instead. And we see Joseph grasp this in chapter 45. The brothers are absolutely dismayed when they realize that it's Joseph stood in front of them. But 3 times Joseph says the same thing to them. God sent me here, not you. God sent me. Why? To save lives, those of the nations and the Egyptians, but also to save your lives. Right, to preserve that promise that God made to Abraham so it would one day be completely fulfilled. And honestly, when I read this again this week as I was preparing, it just struck me like this is honestly remarkable. Honestly, the mercy and the grace and the love of God, that he would use even the brothers' own wickedness and sin and evil, not just for some general good, but to save them. To save them. He uses their own evil to save them, to bring about their good, to ensure their survival. Romans 8, many of us will know this verse. We know that in all things, even our own wickedness and our own sin and our own evil, in all things, God works for the good of those who love him and have been called according to his purpose. How incredible. And then we get this line about Joseph giving them new clothes as he sends them back to get his dad. Again, it's like a complete reversal this time, right? Joseph, whose garment was taken away by his brothers, is now the one who's giving it to them. And in chapter 47, which we didn't read, but we see it again, Pharaoh allows them to live in the best part of the land of Egypt in Goshen. Joseph provides all that his family need to survive. And we get this verse a bit later at the end of chapter 47, where the Egyptians literally cry out to Joseph, "You have saved our lives." We even get that story of Jacob, as I said, blessing Pharaoh twice. Again, another partial fulfillment of God's promise to Abraham, that through his seed, all the peoples, including Pharaoh, of the earth would be blessed. God takes Joseph's pain, his hardship, his waiting, his disappointment, his dreams, and he makes it about more than just Joseph. He makes it about more than just healing wounds from the past. He makes it more than just about setting people free from past sin. He makes it about blessing others and saving his family. That's God's definition of better. Right? But there's still more. Because God's better is also about transforming us. Originally, It was all about Joseph. And he had to be stripped of his ego and his ambition and his expectations in order to learn what it means to trust in God. He had to learn to desire the God who gave him the dreams more than he desired the dream itself. I think we see this happen. Right? I don't think the fact that the brothers don't recognize Joseph is just making a point about his physical appearance changing. I think it's also trying to tell us that Joseph has changed, that God has transformed Joseph. Even while he's testing them to see if they've changed, God has already transformed him. And Judah also embodies this. Joseph's final test for his brothers is recreating, even more specifically than he did with Simeon, what they did to him. So he favors Benjamin, the youngest son of Rachel, as they eat together, giving him 5 times the amount of food as all the rest, showering praise and adoration on him, speaking kindly to him where he spoke harshly to them. The new favored son of Rachel, favored both by Jacob, their dad, and now by Joseph. He's trying to make them drum up all those feelings of jealousy that they once had towards Joseph. And then he plants that silver cup in Benjamin's bag. And as the brothers leave, he stops them and searches them. Benjamin looks guilty, looks like he's nicked it. Joseph says Benjamin's going to be his slave. Will they give up the favored younger son of Rachel into slavery for silver as they did with Joseph in chapter 37, or will they act differently? And then Judah steps in. And we've not covered this in our preaching series, but right in the middle of this story, well, not right in the middle, but in the middle of this story of Joseph, we get a chapter which is not about Joseph at all. Right? Genesis chapter 38 seems like a complete interruption to everything else that's going on. It's got nothing to do with Joseph at all. It's a slightly disturbing story in a number of ways about Joseph's kind of good-for-nothing sons who dishonor his daughter-in-law, Tamar, and so die. It's about Judah being tricked by Tamar, dressed as a prostitute, to give her his seal and his staff in exchange for sex. It's about Judah threatening to burn Tamar when he finds out that she's pregnant to death before she hands him back the seal and the staff and says that these things belonged to the man who got me pregnant. And of course, they belong to Joseph. Bear in mind, all of this has happened just after, in chapter 37, Judah and his brothers have debated or considered murdering Joseph and then decided that they would sell him into slavery instead, because then they both get rid of him and make a bit of money. So that's the kind of guy that Judah is. That's the kind of guy that Judah is. But in being confronted by Tamar in chapter 38, he says this. He recognizes the seal and the staff, and he says, she, Tamar, is more righteous than I am, since I wouldn't give her to my son. Right, a hint of change coming in Judah. It all goes well for Tamar, by the way. But back then in our passage today, Judah steps in, as I said. And we have all of this, we're supposed to have all of this in our minds as we think about Judah stepping in. This is the kind of guy Judah is. He sleeps with his daughter-in-law thinking she's a prostitute. He murders, sells his brother into slavery. Right? This is the kind of guy Judah is. But then incredibly, he offers himself as a substitute for Benjamin, showing care for his brother and his father. There's real change in Judah, genuine repentance expressed in sacrificial love for his brother. His change is part of God's better, right? That Genesis 38 is not an interruption, it's an essential part of the story of God's better. And it's what finally breaks Joseph, Judah doing that, as he realizes that his brothers have changed. Reconciliations come at last as he weeps with them and kisses them and talks to them, and later has this heart-moving reunion with his father. There's genuine repentance for sin and undeserved mercy and grace shown to them by Joseph. Redemption, reconciliation comes, all because Judah offers himself as a substitute. God's better includes transforming sinners, even the worst of them, like Judah and like us, into people of self-sacrificial love. People who love God and who love others. All of the different and the harder and the longer in our lives is leading to us being transformed into the image of Jesus Christ with ever-increasing glory. That's God's better, that we become more like Jesus. Right? Who is Jesus, who is the true and better Joseph, the one who really was the favored and honored son of the Father, who rightly deserves all creation being given to him, not just a fine robe, all creation, and yet didn't use that to his own advantage, but chose to make himself nothing, chose to humble himself, chose to surrender himself and become obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross, chose to bow his head as he gave up his last breath in order to save those that were his enemies. The one who was betrayed by those he loved, handed over for silver, suffered under corrupt power, and yet used his surrender and his suffering and the injustice of all of it to bring salvation to all tribes and all tongues and all peoples and all nations, finally bringing to completion God's promise to Abraham that he would bless all the peoples of the earth through his seed. Jesus, the one who in suffering willingly, in going down to the pit, to the prison, to the grave, was exalted by God to the highest place, so that one day every knee will bow to the one who actually deserves it. Jesus, who is the true and better Judah, the Lion of the tribe of Judah, who rules like a sacrificial lamb, as we read in Revelation, who offers himself as an innocent substitute, not just for his brothers, but for his enemies, who, when there is genuine repentance, offers undeserved mercy and grace in abundance, bringing redemption and reconciliation between us and the Father. Just like with John Perkins, just like with Joseph, the place of affliction, the cross, becomes the place of blessing, right? This time for all humanity and for all of history. Now, you'll be pleased to know that I am not far away from finishing. And I really want to focus our response around two things. And the first of those is God's definition of better. Right? If you have been through pain in some way or are going through it, the loss of a dream, life not being what you thought it would be, if life has been harder than you expected it to be, if your dreams are taking or have taken much longer to come to some kind of reality, if things are different than you ever wanted, in a few moments, not right now, in a few moments, I'm just going to invite you to come to the front and simply invite you to surrender your idea of better over to God and ask him to take your pain and catch it up in a story that blesses others, so that your place of affliction can become the place of blessing too. So that's the first response. And then the second response is around reconciliation. To cut a long story short, it's been a difficult couple of years for me personally. I came into eldership in 2023, and by the end of that year, I was having anxiety attacks and suicidal thoughts. And then in 2024, that all came out at an elders meeting. It was all hidden before that. And I had 4 months off of work and church and a phased return back to the end of the year. And then last year, as many of you will know, Colin stepped down, had some time off, and he and Emma decided to leave in October. I had all these dreams of being in this great team, all these dreams of the kind of leader that I would be. But this wasn't really the start to church leadership that I was dreaming of or expecting. You know, it took a long time. I felt God speak to me about eldership in my late teens. I wouldn't have said it then for fear of coming across as presumptuous or arrogant. But I was 33, 32 when I finally became an elder. Right, it's so far been much harder than I expected it to be. And it's different as well, because I thought I'd be doing it with all of us here, not a man down. But to be very honest with you, in all of it, the hardest thing for me is that my relationship with Colin remains broken. Nigel let us know as elders about Colin's resignation on the Friday night, and I sobbed all night and most of the Saturday. And then Sunday wasn't very easy either when we told all of you. But I wrote a prayer in the form of a poem on the Saturday through my tears. I'm not going to read all of it out because it's not for you. But as I was rereading it this week, it spoke to this theme of Joseph. And so I just want to read 4 lines that I wrote. I pray you'd know his life again. I pray we could be friends again one day. That we'll be able to see below the surface of the tensions, that we'll look back and see God's purpose. Joseph was able to see below the surface of the tensions with his brothers. He was able to look back and see God's purpose in all of it. And that's my prayer for my broken relationship. It's not there yet, but it's my prayer. We all have broken relationships in life, don't we? All of us. It might be those who were once close friends. It might be family members, parents, siblings. It might be an ex-husband, wife, partner. It might be your children. We all live with brokenness, all of us. And if we've not encountered it yet, we will. Sorry to be the bearer of bad news. But because of Jesus, there is hope. There is hope. There's hope for reconciliation. And if some of those broken relationships aren't safe to be reconciled because of abuse or whatever it might be, there's hope for healing. There's hope for justice to the sin that's been done to you. Maybe you don't identify with Joseph. Maybe you identify more with the brothers. You've sinned against somebody else, and that's been the cause of the brokenness. Or, like many broken relationships, maybe it's just not that clear cut, and everybody's at fault in some small way. There's hope for forgiveness too. Forgiveness for your sin, forgiveness for theirs. If you have a broken relationship in your life, I just want to encourage you to do one thing this week before I invite you up to the front as well, which is write a letter to that person. You don't have to send it, but write a letter. Where you've done wrong, confess your sin in it and ask for forgiveness. Where you've been hurt, say so and extend your forgiveness to them. And let that letter writing be your prayer to God for hope of reconciliation and forgiveness and justice and healing.